Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another special episode of Civics. Today, we're going to be talking about the right to protest, which is a right. Well, technically, it's called the right to assembly, but generally, protest is what goes along with that. The right to assembly guaranteed in the Constitution. So, what exactly is the right to peaceful protest or the right to assembly? Well, in the United States, everyone has the right to peacefully assemble and protest the government. Protests can take many forms, such as marching, speeches, boycotting something. All the different things are acceptable forms of peaceful protest. Once a protest turns violent, that protest is no longer protected by the Constitution, and generally it becomes unlawful. So once there's some sort of violence or destruction of property or anything like that, it becomes no longer protected by the Constitution. Doesn't mean it's not necessarily right or that there's not a good cause for all that to happen. It's just no longer protected by the Constitution. So which amendment grants us this right? Well, the right to assemble and protest is guaranteed in the First Amendment, along with the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. Since the right is in the Constitution, no form of government in the United States can deprive you of this right. Okay, so nobody can tell you that you cannot assemble and protest. The only way it could be rescinded is if the Constitution were amended, which probably won't happen, or if habeas corpus is suspended, like during the Civil War. This happened due to the insurrection right of the Confederates, and Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, which stopped supervision of the law by the judiciary. Basically, it allowed the government to detain anyone it wanted, even for constitutionally guaranteed rights. So if someone was protesting, they could be arrested, because there was no longer habeas corpus. The judicial system was no longer supervising how the law was being enforced because of the suspension of habeas corpus. There are, of course, some limits on the right to protest, just like there are on all the other freedoms guaranteed in the First Amendment. It is guarded in the Constitution, but like always, we put some limitations on that. The exceptions are generally threats of violence and actions that could risk public safety. So the right to assemble and protest can only be restricted when the safety of the public comes into risk. Protests are often stopped when there's a threat of violence or when protesters do something unsafe, like block traffic on highways or shut down streets, stuff like that. Then the government has the right to say, hey, what you're doing is unsafe. We're not going to let you do that anymore. Many municipal governments also require the acquisition of a permit beforehand. And this is a way to screen assemblies that may break these two exceptions. And it helps the city maintain the safety of the community as a whole and the protesters themselves. So, like if you were going to make a march, let's say in D.C., right, you would have to get a permit beforehand. And that's so that Washington, D.C., can look into what you guys are doing and make sure that you're not going to be breaking these two exceptions. And then that also allows them to protect you, the protesters, from people who might try to harm you while you're protesting, because that has happened before. So this is all, these permits are generally to make sure that everybody stays safe during these protests. Let's talk about a few famous American protests. We might as well, right, since we're here. The first of which would be the Boston Tea Party, which happened in 1773. The Tea Act raised taxes on tea, and so colonists in Boston raided an English trade ship and dumped its contents into the Boston harbor. It was one of the first major acts of defiance against the British, and it ended up paving the way for the American Revolution a couple years later. This is one of the reasons why the freedom to assemble and the freedom to protest is guaranteed in the Constitution. The next one on our list here is the Seneca Falls Convention. In 1848, 300 women rallied in Seneca, New York, to protest the lack of rights for women in the United States and the unequal treatment they received. And soon after the convention, the suffrage movement began in earnest, and women would die for the right to vote in the coming decades. It would take until until the 1900s for that to happen. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire protests happened in 1911 after a devastating fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory killed 146 workers, mostly women in New York. The ensuing protests and labor demonstrations led to worker safety laws, which increased safety regulations and limited the number of hours people were allowed to work. The Montgomery Bus Boycott in the 1950s was organized by Martin Luther King after she was arrested for not giving up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama. This the boycott that would eventually lead to Martin Luther King gaining a national following and really propel the civil rights movement forward. The March on Washington happened later. Over 200,000 protests marched to Washington, D.C. to call for racial equality and economic justice. And this is where Martin Luther King delivered the I Have a Dream speech. And this protest pushed President JFK to push for civil rights legislation, and it was passed in 1964 after he was assassinated. The Stonewall Inn riots occurred in June of 1969 when the New York police raided the gay bar, the Stonewall Inn. The raid caused immediate violent protests and riots that lasted 6 days. The protests would ignite the gay rights movement around the world. The Take Back the Night protests originally started in Europe, but the first American one was held at the University of Southern Florida, and these protests were now held annually to end sexual violence. The LA riots happened in 1992, 6 days after LA, 4 LA police officers were acquitted of beating Rodney King. The unrest only ended when the National Guard and Army came in to bring calm to the city. The protests, there are still protests annually that happen against police brutality and state-sanctioned violence against Black Americans. So this was just a really large outburst of that in LA after a particularly obvious and brutal beating by police officers. The Black Lives Matter protest has kind of taken up that banner, and they began in 2013 after Trayvon Martin was shot by George Zimmerman in his neighborhood. And these protests reinvigorated the civil rights movement, and now the Black Lives Matter organization leads that movement in many respects. In 2016, Native Americans and their allies would gather in North Dakota to halt the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was going to be built over sacred Native lands and potentially contaminate the area's water supply. The protest did motivate President Barack Obama to halt construction of the pipeline. However, Donald Trump took office a couple weeks later and reversed that decision. The Women's March on Washington happened in the very beginning of 2017, and nearly 500,000 people, mostly women, marched down the streets of D.C. to show support for women's rights after the election of Donald Trump. Millions of others took part in similar protests across the nation and the world to show solidarity. It was one of the largest protests to ever occur. In summary, the right to protest has been a cornerstone of American democracy since before the country was even founded, and has led to a lot of big changes in our government and society. The right to freely protest is an essential right and a necessary one to safeguard citizens, non-citizens, and all of our individual liberties. It's one of the ways that makes us, the people of the United States, the fourth branch of our government. We ultimately hold the power over the other 3 branches, and we can let them know what we think through protest and gatherings. We are supposed to be the ones who oversee these branches of government, right? Because they're supposed to work for us. And so communicating with them is important, and this is kind of one of the ways we do that. Thank you guys so much for watching this special episode of Civics. Hope you learned something about our right to protest guaranteed in the Constitution and some of the more famous protests in American history. And we'll see you soon with more Civics. Bye.